A woman vanishes from a theater balcony, leaving only a shadow behind. Welcome to Eco Mistiosa. I am your host, Arvela. Let's connect. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from today. Your presence means everything. Can't wait to read your comments. Now, let's begin. It was in the brisk first week of October, in the year 1894, that a peculiarly melancholic case found its way to Baker Street. I remember the morning well, for the chill had returned to London with a vengeance, the autumn fog casting its sallow veil over the rooftops. And I had just come back from an early round through the Marylebone district with my medical bag half empty, and my spirits not much fuller. Sherlock Holmes sat at his accustomed post by the fire, a Persian slipper of tobacco nestled beside him, and the Times strewn in careless folds on the rug. His violin lay untouched upon the table, and from the slight curve of his fingers against the arm of his chair, I could see he was on the cusp of some mental occupation, though he had said nothing since I arrived. "What do you make of this, Watson?" he said, suddenly, lifting his gaze to meet mine with that peculiarly sharp light in his eyes that always made me feel as though I had already missed something important. He handed me a telegram, creased, hastily folded, and bearing the markings of hurried composition. "Murder last night at Royal Bradbury. Box 7, second balcony. Victim Lord Cornwell. No witnesses. Police baffle. Window demands your attention. Spectre. Lestrade. Royal Bradbury." I mused aloud, recalling the lavish opera house near Grosvenor Square. Lord Cornwell, wasn't he recently appointed to the Admiralty? Holmes nodded. Only a fortnight ago. A man of discreet power, which makes his sudden demise all the more unsettling. Shot once in the chest. No struggle, no sound, and not a soul claims to have seen or heard the act. He steepled his fingers and stared into the flames, a theater full of eyes, yet the murderer performs unnoticed. That is art, Watson. Dark. I take it we are to visit the scene?" I asked, already setting down my bag. Holmes rose in a single motion. "We are to meet Inspector Lestrade at the Royal Bradbury in half an hour. But first," he added, reaching for his overcoat, "a detour. The widow has requested our presence before the police have finished their interviews." "The widow?" I echoed. "Lady Margaret Cornwell. They say she did not scream, not once, sat perfectly still in her gown of midnight blue until the final curtain fell. Lady Margaret Cornwell resided in an elegant row house just a block from the opera house itself. Convenient, perhaps too convenient. A footman received us with the stiff unease of one who had been recently scolded, and we were ushered into a sitting room, dark with velvet drapery and dense with the fragrance of some cloying floral perfume. She stood when we entered, tall and pale as frost, her posture perfect, her widow's veil fluttering ever so slightly with each breath. Her face, though composed, bore the brittle tension of a mask held for too long. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice low and clear, "I was told you might uncover what the police cannot." Holmes inclined his head, his gaze already dissecting the lines of her silhouette. "My condolences, Lady Cornwell. Please tell us everything you witnessed last night." "There is nothing to tell," she replied, her voice calm, too calm perhaps. "We arrived before the performance began. Don Giovanni, Edward's favorite. We sat in our box, as always. He leaned toward me once during the first act, said the tenor was mediocre and that he would speak to the director. The next time I looked at him, during the overture of the second act, he was gone." "You mean dead?" I asked. His eyes were open. There was no sound, no cry. I did not even see him fall. Her voice faltered, just once, but she quickly recovered. A trickle of blood beneath his cravat. That was all. "No flash? No smoke? No figure in the shadows?" Holmes prompted. She shook her head slowly. "Nothing." We were alone in the box. The door was locked from within. Yet someone must have entered. "Unless the killer fired from the opposite balcony," she said, almost too quickly. "The police are investigating that." Holmes studied her in silence for a moment, then gestured toward the corner of the room. "That trunk, may I?" She followed his gaze and nodded, with swift hands. Holmes opened the modest traveling case. Inside were 2 opera cloaks, one male and one female, a compact case of cosmetics, and a small velvet pouch which he opened to reveal a scattering of pearl-topped hairpins. He examined the pins closely, then sniffed the interior of the pouch. Lavender and valerian, he murmured. Calming herbs. You have difficulty sleeping, Lady Cornwell. Since my husband's death, yes. You mean before? Holmes corrected gently. She hesitated. I suffer from nerves. That is not a crime. No, said Holmes, letting the pouch fall shut. But it is a clue. The Royal Bradbury loomed through the fog like a palace adrift in mist. Lestrade met us just inside the vestibule, pale and fuming, rubbing his hands together with irritation. We've questioned every usher, every vendor, and half the audience, he muttered. No one saw a thing. Shot clean through the heart and no one noticed. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying it's infuriating. Then let's have a look at the box, Holmes replied briskly. Box 7 on the second balcony was modest, though finely appointed. Plush seats, velvet drapes, and a small glass table for refreshments. The blood stain had been discreetly blotted from the carpet, though Holmes knelt immediately to inspect the spot. The corpse was discovered here, he said, tapping the floor gently with his cane. Head leaned toward the aisle. Curtain was drawn most of the second act. Ah! He reached up to the drapery and pulled a tiny sliver of wax from the folds. What is it? I asked. Residue, Holmes murmured. Red sealing wax, perhaps from a correspondence, perhaps from something else entirely. He stood and turned sharply toward the opposite balcony. Watson, tell me, what do you see when you look at box 11 over there? I followed his gaze. The box was darkened, vacant. Nothing unusual, I said. Except that light. There's a flicker on the floor. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Precisely. Someone was there during the performance last night, and they left in such haste they failed to notice the wax, still warm, drop from their person onto the drapery across the hall. He turned back to Lestrade. Inspector, I would like a list of all those seated in boxes 10 through 12 last night, including staff. What do you suspect, Holmes? I asked, as Lestrade hurried off. I suspect, Holmes said coolly, that the murderer played to a full house and was applauded for it. Holmes said nothing as we descended from the second balcony and exited into the corridor behind the boxes. But I could tell his mind was furiously at work. His fingers twitched at his sides in that odd little dance they often performed when a thread had presented itself, fragile, nearly invisible, but worthy of pursuit. We passed by a harried stagehand adjusting a rope pulley near the side entrance to the stage, and Holmes paused, eyes narrowing. You were here last night? He asked the man without introduction. The fellow blinked at us, then gave a stiff nod. Aye, sir. I'm always back here during performances. I manage the fly system for curtain cues. Did you see or hear anything unusual during the second act? The man scratched his head. Unusual how? Unusual in any way, Holmes pressed. Movements in the wings, sounds during the overture, anything that deviated from routine. The man seemed about to dismiss the question, then hesitated. Now that you mention it, there was a bit of confusion just before the second act. One of the performers from the chorus lost a shoe, made quite the noise trying to retrieve it. She ducked back in through the rear stair. I didn't get a look, just heard a ruckus. But I remember, 'cause the soprano near had a fit about the timing. Holmes gave a satisfied hem. Curious. And was that entrance the rear stair secured afterward? Should have been. Lee Dorman says he checked it. Locked by the third act, but not before. Holmes asked. No, sir. Not that I can say. Holmes offered a curt nod, and we moved on. In the low light of the passage, he said quietly. You see, Watson, the floor begins to show itself. A woman from the chorus unaccounted for during a critical window, and a rear stair, left temporarily unguarded. Combine that with a box locked from within, and we begin to form a picture. But surely you don't suspect a chorus girl of assassinating a member of the Admiralty, I said. No, Holmes replied with the hint of a smile. But I suspect someone wanted us to suspect just that. Come, let us inspect box 11. We found it unoccupied, though Lestrade had already posted a constable outside, with a brief flash of his card. Holmes gained us entry. The box was smaller than box 7, somewhat plainer in its furnishings. Holmes dropped to his haunches at once, examining the floor near the railing. Ah, he said softly. He produced a pocket lens and peered intently at the worn velvet of the railing's armrest. Then he pointed. Wax. Again. This time fully congealed, and here. See this indent, a tripod mark. Slight, but unmistakable. Likely the base of a compact monocular or miniature spyglass. Someone watched the Cornwells with great attention during the performance. He stood and turned to me, his expression animated. It would have been a clear shot from here, if one was so inclined, but too exposed, too visible. So then, why the wax? Why the spyglass? To observe their reactions, I suggested. Indeed. Or to confirm timing. He straightened. They needed to know the exact moment when Lord Cornwell would be distracted, or motionless. It wasn't the murder itself that required concealment. It was its orchestration. The act, Watson, was as much a performance as the opera. At that moment a low voice called to us from the corridor. Lestrade returned, list in hand. Here you are, Holmes, boxes 10 through 12. As expected, minor nobles, foreign guests, and 2 critics. Holmes scanned the names rapidly, then pointed. Here. Who is Mr. Bellamy? American, Lestrade replied. Traveling alone. Said he was researching a book on the London stage. Gave a Bloomsbury boarding address. Very good. And this name, Mrs. Astley. Widow. Husband was a playwright. She's been a fixture here for years. But Lestrade hesitated. She has a reputation for being, what's the word, over-familiar, odd bird. Holmes folded the list and tucked it into his coat. We shall call upon both, but I wish to see the widow again first. Lady Margaret was in her dressing room now, a suite adjoined to the opera house via a private corridor. Though dimly lit and adorned with flowers, it had the distinct air of a room designed more for display than comfort. She stood at the mirror as we entered, adjusting the veil over her hat. She met Holmes's gaze in the glass. You found something? She asked without turning. A fragment, Holmes said. I would ask you a delicate question, Lady Cornwell. She turned slowly. Go on. Were there any tensions between your husband and others? Political adversaries, personal entanglements, anything that might shed light on why he was targeted? She gave a faint, joyless smile. My husband was not a popular man, Mr. Holmes. He made no effort to be. He had enemies, certainly rivals in Parliament, men whose contracts he ended, even a few military officers he had stripped of rank. But if you mean affairs of the heart, no, not that I knew of. And yet, Holmes said quietly, there is a woman's scent in your opera box. Not your own, slightly spiced. Musk, perhaps patchouli, someone with a bolder taste. Lady Margaret blinked. Then she was not there with me. No, Holmes said. But she may have entered while the curtain was drawn. Impossible, she said faintly. I would have seen. Holmes gave a small bow. Would you? The curtain was thick, and your attention elsewhere. May I ask, do you recall anyone entering or exiting the box in the final minute before the overture? She thought for a moment, then shook her head. No, though I did notice something. Just as the conductor raised his baton, there was a faint glimmer near the lower curtain edge, as though something metallic had caught the light. Thank you, Holmes said with sudden intensity. That will do. I believe I know where we must look next. As we left, I said, Holmes, what glimmer could she have seen? A barrel, Holmes said grimly. But not from the opposite balcony, from below. Box 7 overhangs the stalls. If someone were positioned directly underneath, with a silenced weapon. A silenced weapon. In 8, he raised an eyebrow. Not truly silenced, of course, but muffled, a tightly packed cloth. A small caliber. A musical crescendo to mask the sound. It has been done before once, in Milan. And the locked box was never locked, Holmes said. Merely seemed so. I examined the latch. It clicks shut, even when not engaged. A simple illusion, meant to mislead, and it succeeded. By the time we arrived at the box office records room, dusk had begun to press its fingers against the high windows. Holmes moved swiftly among the ledgers, tracing reservations and purchases for Box 7 across the previous weeks. Here, he said suddenly. 2 weeks ago the box was reserved under the name G. Astley. And again last Tuesday. Mrs. Astley, I asked. Indeed, but not for herself. For guests, she said. Now, if Mrs. Astley reserved the box last week, and the same scent appears again on the evening of the murder, he turned on his heel. We go to Bloomsbury. Mr. Bellamy proved more elusive than expected. The landlady at the boarding house informed us that he had checked out early that morning without notice. Left no forwarding address, only paid up to the week. Odd, she said, because he'd seemed very interested in the opera house. Even asked whether the windows on the upper floors had a view of the west entrance. Holmes examined the modest room with rapid efficiency. Empty wardrobe, unwashed tea mug, and crucially a scrap of notepaper left behind. Upon it was written one name in a firm American hand, Cornwell. Holmes tucked the paper into his coat. Watson, we have our ghost, a man with no past and a vanished trail. And a widow with too calm a mask. But Holmes, I said, what links them? Why the deception with the boxes? That, Holmes said, eyes flashing. We shall learn when we speak to Mrs. Astley, and we must do so tonight, before she vanishes too. He tapped the wax-stained slip of the theater list in his coat. Because if I am right, Watson, we are no longer dealing merely with revenge or jealousy. He stepped into the fog, his coat flaring like the wing of a crow. This is a performance of murder, he said, and someone has yet to take their final bow. It was well past 9 when we reached the residence of Mrs. Eugenia Astley, a narrow 4-story house tucked between a hatter's shop and an apothecary, on Fitzroy Street. The gaslights flickered in the fog as Holmes pressed the bell, which rang with a metallic shudder inside. After a moment the door opened a fraction, revealing a suspicious eye behind a brass chain. We are here to see Mrs. Astley, Holmes said with a polite nod. It is a matter of urgent importance. The door remained unmoved. She doesn't receive callers at this hour. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small white card. Then perhaps she will make an exception for Mr. Sherlock Holmes. There was a pause. The chain unlatched. Inside, the hallway was dim and perfumed with a heavy floral scent, not unlike the trace we'd found in Box 7. A young maid led us up the stairs with evident reluctance and rapped softly on a door at the rear of the second floor. A voice, low and melodious, replied. Show them. Mrs. Eugenia Astley was not, as I had imagined, an elderly matron swathed in black. She was striking tall, with ash-blonde hair drawn tightly from her face, her grey eyes keen and unblinking. A robe of indigo silk hung from her shoulders, and a cigarette burned, forgotten in the tray beside her chair. Mr. Holmes, she said with something between amusement and caution. I suppose I should be flattered. Please, sit. Holmes remained standing. You reserved Box 7 at the Royal Bradbury twice in the past fortnight. Once under your own name, and once for guests whose names were not recorded. On the night of Lord Cornwell's murder, traces of your perfume were found in that box, despite your claim that you were seated in Box 11. Her eyes remained fixed on his. Have I been accused of something? No, Holmes said mildly. But I should like to know what business you had with Lord Cornwell. She let out a soft breath and leaned back in her chair. Edward Cornwell and I were once acquainted, briefly. A very long time ago. Briefly, Holmes repeated. A single season, she said. He was engaged to Margaret within the year, and yet you attended Don Giovanni on the night he died. I attend the theater often. Do you accuse every woman who admires Mozart of murder? Holmes's tone sharpened. Mrs. Astley, a man was shot at close range in a sealed box, and the faint scent of your perfume, an exotic blend I might add, lingered in the drapery nearest the scene. What should I conclude? She met his gaze without blinking. That I leaned forward to speak to a friend during the intermission. That I passed the Cornwell's box in the corridor. That I brushed against the curtains. Nothing more. Holmes stepped toward the hearth. He picked up the small jar of wax on the mantelpiece and examined it briefly. The same crimson hue as the droplet he had found at the theater. You sealed a letter recently, he said. I correspond regularly, she said lightly. May I see the letter? She raised an eyebrow. You may not. Holmes replaced the jar and turned. Then let us speak plainly. Who was the man sitting beside you in box 11? There was no man, she replied, too quickly. Holmes smiled thinly. Your box contained 2 glasses and the residue of a man's cologne, sandalwood and myrrh. Expensive, foreign. You are not as solitary as you pretend. Mrs. Astley rose, gathering her robe about her. What is it you truly want, Mr. Holmes? I want the name of the man who accompanied you. I want to know why he left London before dawn, and I want to know how he came into possession of Lord Cornwell's private itinerary for the week. She stiffened. I don't know what you mean. Yes, Holmes said softly. You do. She said nothing. Her lips pressed into a line, and her eyes narrowed to slits. Finally, she said, You've come too late. Holmes tilted his head. Too late for what? He's gone, she said. And even if I told you where, but you won't, Holmes said, cutting her off. Because you believe you're protecting someone, or perhaps protecting yourself. She looked away. You don't understand. Holmes turned to the door. On the contrary, Mrs. Astley, I understand perfectly. Outside, in the dense quiet of the fog. Holmes walked for some time without speaking. I followed in silence until he stopped beneath a lamp-post and pulled the list Lestrade had given him from his coat. She was lying, I said. Of course, Holmes replied. And not even well. About Cornwell. About everything, Holmes said. She knew the man who sat beside her. She helped him gain entry. She may even have misdirected the theater staff while he slipped into box 7. But why? What motive? Holmes tapped the paper in his hand. Lord Cornwell was not only a bureaucrat, he oversaw contracts for naval expansions, warships, munitions. Whoever killed him wanted a silence insured, a contract buried, or a scandal avoided. The answer lies not only in who shot him, but who benefited from his death. And the widow? I asked. You still suspect her? I suspect she knows more than she admits. Her calm, her lack of curiosity, all signs. She may not have orchestrated the death, but I believe she consented to it. And the American? He was the lever, Holmes murmured. Not the mind. Someone manipulated him. Someone with access to Cornwell's plans. Someone with a grudge, older than the curtain call. He began walking again, his pace quickening. To Scotland Yard? I asked. No, to Whitehall. I stopped short. The government? Holmes turned. The archives, Watson. Cornwell's dealings will be there. And if my theory holds, they will reveal the motive. It was nearing midnight when we reached the records division at Whitehall. Holmes had sent word ahead, under one of his many aliases, and the clerk on duty, a pale man with spectacles and ink-stained sleeves, led us to the appropriate files without question. For an hour Holmes combed through contracts, naval appointments, and procurement memos. Then he stopped, one hand frozen on a folder stamped with the Admiralty seal. Here, he said, a confidential suspension order, dated 3 weeks ago. Cornwell was preparing to halt a munitions contract. one awarded to a firm in Manchester, Astley and Broderick Export Limited. Related to Mrs. Astley? I asked. Her late husband's family, Holmes said. And the Broderick name appears again here. Geoffrey Broderick served as a liaison during the Boer campaign, court-martialed. Dismissed quietly. Holmes's eyes narrowed, and now vanished from Bloomsbury. Last seen beside a woman whose perfume lingers at a murder scene. I said nothing for a moment, watching Holmes' mind move behind his stillness. Then this wasn't a crime of passion, I said at last. No, Holmes said. It was vengeance, and the theater merely a stage. Back in Baker Street, Holmes poured himself a brandy and settled into his chair with a sigh. Tomorrow, he said, we shall visit the Manchester factory. If my suspicions are correct, we'll find irregular shipments, and perhaps a ledger or two that explains why Lord Cornwall had to be silenced. And Mrs. Astley, he swirled the brandy slowly. She will not run. Not yet. She believes herself unassailable, elegant, untouchable. But the thing about masks, Watson, is that they always slip eventually. He raised his glass in a dry salute. To the next act, he said. The following morning dawned bleak and wet, the sky pressing low over London, as if burdened by the weight of what was yet to unfold. Holmes was up before I was, and by the time I descended to the sitting room he had already penned 2 telegrams, sent a boy with a third, and was leaning over a stack of folded train schedules like a general planning a campaign. Manchester, he said crisply, without looking up. The 9:7 from Euston will do. Pack lightly. What precisely do you expect to find at Astley and Broderick? I asked as I reached for the coffee Mrs. Hudson had left warming on the hearth. Paperwork, Holmes replied. Invoices, ledgers, contracts. And if we are fortunate, the residue of concealment. When a man dies to keep a secret, that secret is rarely buried far. I hesitated, coffee cup halfway to my lips. You believe the firm was dealing illegally? Holmes nodded, eyes scanning the schedule. Or unethically. The suspension order Cornwall drafted hinted at a pattern of delayed shipments and inflated charges. If that contract were revoked, someone stood to lose a great deal of money, and Geoffrey Broderick, court-martialed and publicly disgraced, had reason enough to bear a grudge. And Mrs. Astley? Holmes turned to me. She had every reason to protect the family's interests, whether out of loyalty or desperation. I cannot yet say, but I do not believe she was unaware of what her companion planned. The seating arrangements at the theater, the wax, the vantage point, the distraction at the stair, all bespoke orchestration. Then the murder was planned weeks in advance, meticulously, like a composer crafting a symphony, and it was executed not with panic or fury, but with precision. Whoever fired the shot was no amateur. We reached Euston in time, and the journey northward passed in relative silence, save for Holmes' occasional remarks as he sifted through the folder of notes and transcribed details from the files at Whitehall. I watched the countryside blur past, the grey of the morning broken only by the low silhouettes of distant mills and the smokestacks that heralded our approach to Manchester. By noon, we stood before the offices of Astley and Broderick Export Limited, a red brick building nestled between 2 soot-darkened warehouses along the canal. The brass plaque beside the door had dulled with neglect, and the windows bore the grimy glaze of indifference. Inside, a thin clerk with ink-stained cuffs peered at us over his spectacles. Holmes offered a card with a flourish. "We are here to inquire about certain shipping records pertaining to government contracts," he said, in the clipped, authoritative tone he reserved for impersonating mid-level officials. "There's been a clerical discrepancy. Routine audit." The clerk blinked. "May I ask what division you represent?" "Department of Oversight and Allocation," Holmes replied smoothly. "My colleague, Dr. Watson, is responsible for inventory cross-confirmation." The clerk, clearly intimidated by bureaucracy, ushered us into a back room cluttered with ledgers and crates. Holmes made a show of taking random notes while I leafed through invoices with little understanding of what I was meant to be verifying. After some minutes, Holmes quietly pointed to a set of entries marked in red pencil. "Observe," he said under his breath. "Dates aligned with shipments to naval bases in Portsmouth and Chatham. 3 discrepancies already. Tonnage mismatches. Adjusted values. See this. They claim to have sent 5 crates of shell casings. Portsmouth reports receiving 3. The difference is profit and fraud," I added. "Precisely. And likely worse than fraud." He flipped another page. Some of these shipments were never confirmed at all. A missing cargo is one thing, but the absence of inquiry, that implies collusion. Someone within the Admiralty, or someone protected by it. Footsteps approached. Holmes closed the ledger and straightened just as the door opened and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped in. "Mr. Grayson," the clerk announced nervously. "These men are here from—" "Yes," I heard Grayson cut in. His accent was faintly northern, his gaze hard. "You'll have to leave. Audits require written notice." Holmes met his stare evenly. "You'll find the authorization with your man at the port in an hour. Until then, we'll require these ledgers to be kept untouched. I don't think, unless of course you'd prefer we escalate this to Whitehall directly." Holmes offered a thin smile. Grayson hesitated, jaw clenched. "Fine, but be quick about it." He turned on his heel and left. Holmes waited until his steps faded, then resumed flipping pages rapidly. "There," he murmured, "an order signed by Broderick last week. Which means, despite being officially absent, he's still exerting influence here. Or—" A knock interrupted us again, and this time it was the clerk, wide-eyed, clutching a telegram. "For Mr. Holmes," he said, looking uncertain. "Just arrived." Holmes took it, unfolded it, and read quickly. His expression sharpened. "Well," he said, "Watson, the widow moves faster than we thought." He handed me the telegram. It read, "Holmes, Lady Margaret Cornwell has left London. No forwarding address. Servant claims she took no luggage. Lestrade, she's vanished," I said. "Or gone to meet someone," Holmes said. "Either Broderick or someone who helped him. Either way, she's no longer in play. Not in the open, at least." We gathered what we could, copying the most telling entries into Holmes's notebook, and left the warehouse under a sullen sky. Holmes said little until we reached the station again. There, as the train pulled away southward, he leaned back in the carriage and tapped the window thoughtfully. "It was never about the murder alone," he said. "It was about erasing a voice. Cornwell had learned the contract was a shell, drained for money, possibly weapons, certainly favors. He moved to cut it. And that sealed his fate. And Mrs. Astley? She brokered access," Holmes said. "Revenge, perhaps. Old wounds, old bitterness. But I believe she didn't plan for Cornwell to die, only to be disgraced." Broderick took it further. "He acted, and now she's running from that, or toward it." I frowned. "Then what now?" Holmes folded his arms. "Now we return to London. We find Broderick, and we see whether the performance has another act yet to play." As the rain began to streak the window pane, Holmes closed his eyes briefly, but I knew he was not resting. He was arranging the final pieces, watching the stage in his mind. And somewhere in the wings, the last player was about to make their entrance. The return journey to London was a quiet one, though not for lack of conversation. Holmes spoke little, but the flicker of calculation behind his eyes told me his thoughts were anything but still. He tapped out a rhythm against the edge of the train compartment, not musical but mechanical, as though counting gears in a sequence only he could see. At last, as the rain darkened the glass to a near mirror, he spoke without turning. "There is a gap, Watson. A thread we've not yet followed." "Which one?" I asked, though I knew he had sifted through dozens by now. "Lady Margaret's disappearance," he replied. "Too convenient. Too soon. A woman of her composure does not flee without cause. She may have feared arrest." Holmes shook his head faintly. "Or feared Broderick, more than feared exposure. That tells us something." He turned now, to face me directly. If she believed Broderick to be merely vengeful, she would have distanced herself from the murder, not vanished. No, she fled because something she didn't know was suddenly revealed. Something about the murder she hadn't anticipated. I tried to follow the line of thought. You believe Broderick acted beyond their arrangement. Precisely. I believe he went off script. Margaret Cornwell may have abetted a political scandal. Yes, but a cold-blooded assassination in a public venue, on British soil. I suspect that shocked even her. Holmes sat back, interlacing his fingers. And when the curtain fell, she realized she was no longer a conspirator. She was a witness. We arrived at Baker Street just past 5 o'clock. The street lamps sputtering to life as the evening fog thickened. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with the usual fretful murmurings about wet coats and the state of the umbrella stand, which Holmes ignored entirely. He flung his coat onto the arm of the settee and went straight to the mantelpiece, where a fresh telegram waited. He read it quickly, then handed it to me. The message was short, from Lestrade. Surveillance on Astley House, inconclusive. No sightings of Broderick. Servant found unconscious in cellar. Stable empty. Horse missing. Believe vehicle used to depart city. Holmes tapped the telegram with one long finger. So, Broderick has surfaced. Briefly, and with violence, but toward a servant. I asked. Someone got too close, or stumbled into the wrong room. It suggests panic or urgency. Holmes moved to his desk and pulled open a drawer. From within, he retrieved a small portfolio, which he opened on the table under the lamplight. Watson, do remember that listless strayed provided, those seated in the boxes near the Cornwells. Of course, there was one other name, Holmes said, flipping pages. One we dismissed, Mr. Adrian Larch. The name struck no chord with me. And who is he? Holmes handed me a thin file. A financier, operates quietly, mostly in wartime contracts. His name appears in several naval procurement circles. Never at the center, always just beneath the surface. But he's been linked indirectly to Astley and Broderick before. I scanned the sheet. He was in box 10? Yes, Holmes said. And seated alone. But now I wonder, did he see something, or was he there to ensure something? The fire popped in the grate as Holmes rose, paced once, and stopped before the window. I need to speak to Larch, he said. Tonight. Do you think he'll receive you? I doubt it, Holmes said. Which is why I won't give him the choice. Within the hour, we stood before a polished door on Wilton Crescent, its knocker shaped like a lion's head. A manservant admitted us, after a brief and no doubt deceptive conversation with Holmes, who introduced himself as a solicitor with interest in naval bonds. The drawing room was spacious and opulently furnished, though it bore the cold perfection of wealth spent without sentiment. Mr. Adrian Larch entered from a side corridor, a lean, fox-like man with an immaculately tailored waistcoat and eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Holmes, he said without waiting for introduction. Your reputation precedes you. Holmes offered a faint smile. Then I shall not insult you by pretending to be anyone else. Larch gave the smallest of shrugs and crossed to the fireplace. What interest does the great detective take in my affairs? I take interest, Holmes replied, in any man who sits within 15 feet of a murder and offers no testimony. Larch turned. I saw nothing. The curtain was drawn. The lights dimmed. You know as well as I do that a man could be stabbed in an opera box, and no one would look up unless it affected the soprano. Holmes took a slow step forward. But you were looking. You observed the Cornwells closely, through an opera glass. Why? Larch paused, eyes narrowing. You're mistaken. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a small cloth pouch, from which he drew a fragment of red wax. Then perhaps this residue recovered from your railing was deposited by accident, or perhaps the impression left by a collapsible field glass was also mere coincidence. Larch's lips twitched. What are you implying? That you were not there as a patron? Holmes said quietly. You were there as an observer. either to ensure the execution of a plan or to blackmail those who would. The silence that followed was brittle as glass. Then Larch chuckled softly and moved to pour himself a drink. "You're clever, Holmes. But even clever men forget the limitations of proof. I saw nothing. I know nothing. And if you're hoping for a confession, you'll need to try a sharper knife." Holmes didn't move. "No need for a confession, only time. You've tied yourself to Broderick, and Broderick is unraveling faster than you realize." Larch turned then, eyes cold. "I have no ties to that man." Holmes met his gaze with quiet assurance. "Then you've nothing to fear when he's found, or when he speaks." Holmes left without another word, and I followed, glancing back only once at the figure of Larch silhouetted in the firelight, his glass untouched in his hand. Out in the fog again, Holmes lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. "He's bluffing," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "He's calculating. Men like Larch don't threaten. They purchase silence or remove problems, which means we've now threatened his investment. And that makes us his problem." We crossed through St. James's Park in silence, the gas lamps flickering behind the trees like the eyes of watchers. At last, Holmes said, "There's no more time to wait. We bring this to Lestrade now. He must issue the warrant for Broderick. We pressure the railway stations, the ports, the man will run. And when he runs, he'll lead us to what's been buried." "And the widow?" I asked. Holmes exhaled smoke. "She will reappear once she's certain her part is done. But I don't believe she's as distant from the fire as she pretends. Not anymore." At Baker Street, the lamplight shone golden in the mist. A figure stood waiting outside the door, drenched, nervous, clutching a valise. It was Lady Margaret Cornwell. As Holmes approached, she stepped forward, her voice low and ragged. "I don't know who else to trust," she said. Holmes said nothing. He opened the door and let her in. Lady Margaret stepped inside with a slowness that betrayed exhaustion, more emotional than physical. Her veil, though soaked, clung tightly to her brow, and the fingers that clutched her valise were trembling ever so slightly. Holmes said nothing as he closed the door behind her, only gestured toward the fire, where the warmth offered refuge from the sodden night. I brought her a towel, and she accepted it with the faintest nod of gratitude, but her eyes remained fixed on Holmes. It was a look I had seen before, on soldiers who had come to the field hospital not for stitches, but to confess something that had begun long before the wound. Holmes took his chair and waited. She sat opposite him, her spine straight despite her fatigue. "I lied to you," she said softly. "Not because I wished to protect Jeffrey, but because I believed I understood the boundaries of what had been planned. I did not." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Start at the beginning." She closed her eyes. "Jeffrey came to me 6 months ago. He was ruined, not just in reputation but in opportunity. Every door in London had closed to him, and he believed it was Edward's doing. He was right. Partially. My husband had intercepted a request Jeffrey made for reinstatement through a mutual contact, and he denied it, harshly, and in writing." She looked down, as though ashamed. "Jeffrey still loved me, that much I knew. And I pitied him. He asked me for one thing, to gain access to Edward's private schedule. Nothing violent, he swore. Just enough to shake Edward publicly, some revelation. A scandal. I told myself it was nothing more than political vengeance. I gave Jeffrey the information. And Box 7? Holmes asked. He wanted to be there, she said, to witness Edward's embarrassment when it happened. I arranged for him to occupy it under an assumed name on the night of the opera. I reserved another box for myself so that we wouldn't be seen together, and Mrs. Astley, Margaret, hesitated. She acted as an intermediary. It was through her that Jeffrey communicated most of his plans. She provided the arrangements. She handled the tickets. I never saw Jeffrey directly until that night. Holmes steepled his fingers. But something changed. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, I knew something had gone wrong the moment the overture began. Geoffrey appeared only for an instant, near the aisle of Box 7. He was dressed differently than I remembered, clean-shaven. No military posture. He wore a dark scarf. He glanced up toward me, I swear, just for a second, and then stepped behind the curtain. When I looked back, Edward was slumped. Her voice cracked. I didn't understand. I froze. I told myself it couldn't be what it looked like. You knew then he had gone further than he promised. Yes, she whispered, but I couldn't move. Not until the final curtain. Holmes rose and walked slowly to the fireplace, speaking as much to the flames as to her. You've placed yourself dangerously close to conspiracy, but your return here suggests a shift. Why now? Her voice steadied slightly. Because Geoffrey sent me a letter. This morning. She reached into her valise and withdrew a small envelope, its flap still sealed with the same red wax we had seen in the drapery at the Royal Bradbury. Holmes broke the seal gently and unfolded the contents. I stepped forward to read over his shoulder. Margaret, it's done. And it's only the beginning. You may not understand now, but you will. Edward was the first. Others will fall soon enough. You must vanish. Stay hidden. The stage will be mine again soon. 3. Holmes read it twice, then lowered it slowly. He believes himself a crusader, a righteous actor in a play of vengeance. Margaret nodded. He's unwell, and he's more dangerous than I ever imagined. And yet you came to us, I said. Knowing that meant exposing yourself. Because I'm done running, she said. I can't undo what I've done, but I won't aid him further. If you can stop him, I'll help you. Holmes looked at her for a long moment, then gave the slightest nod. You said he called it only the beginning. Did he mention anyone else? She hesitated. No names, but I believe he meant Adrian Lodge. Holmes didn't react, but I saw the glint in his eye. He called on me once, after Edward died, she continued. Not to console, but to caution. Said I mustn't speak with anyone. That the performance wasn't yet over, and that my reputation depended on silence. Holmes turned sharply to me. Watson, fetch Lestrade. Now, bring him here. I reached for my coat at once. Tell him we have a material witness and sufficient cause to issue 2 warrants. Holmes called after me. 1 for Geoffrey Broderick, 1 for Adrian Lodge. By the time I returned with the inspector, damp, irritable, and trailing a young constable, Holmes had compiled a precise summary of Margaret's testimony and his deductions thus far. Lestrade read the letter in silence, then leaned against the mantel with a sigh. I knew Lodge was slime, but never thought he'd soil his gloves with murder. He hasn't, Holmes said. Not directly, but he bankrolled the performance. Broderick pulled the trigger, but Lodge arranged the venue, the materials, the vanishing acts. He is not an accomplice. He is the director. Lestrade nodded grimly. And Broderick? Holmes turned to the window, watching the fog pulse under the lamplight. He's preparing for something else. The tone of that letter suggests more targets, more violence. And he believes himself immune. Lestrade pulled a pad from his coat. We'll spread word to the ports. Railways too. He can't hide forever. I disagree, Holmes said softly. He doesn't plan to hide. He plans to return to the stage. Lestrade frowned. What do you mean? Holmes turned from the window. He'll return to the opera house. Margaret gasped. No, he wouldn't dare. He would, Holmes said calmly. Because that's where he became visible, where he chose to act. He won't resist repeating the symbolism. The shadows between acts, the final bow. Lestrade muttered something under his breath. We'll post men there at once. Holmes nodded. But keep them hidden. I want him to feel unseen. Let him step into the light. And you. Holmes reached for his coat. I shall go in first. Alone. Margaret stood. Holmes, you must be careful. Geoffrey, he's not the man I knew. He's something else now. There's rage behind him, and grief he never released. Holmes regarded her kindly. Grief is dangerous when it finds a mask. Outside, the fog was thick again, curling around the railings and muffling the world to a hush. But I felt no peace in it. Something darker was gathering now, not just in the streets or shadows, but in the mind of a man who believed death was theater and justice a stage for revenge. And Holmes, as always, had chosen to enter just before the curtain rose. The Royal Bradbury loomed out of the fog like a brooding galleon at anchor, its white stone facade bleached pale under the gaslights. Though the night's performance was still hours away, Holmes had arranged discreet entry through a side passage used by the chorus and technicians. Lestrade had positioned plainclothes officers throughout the building, blending them among janitors, vendors, and ushers, each man given strict instructions: observe but do not confront. Not until Holmes gave the signal, we moved through the back corridors in silence. The great theater felt curiously different when empty, not simply hollow but expectant, like a stage holding its breath. Holmes's steps were noiseless as we reached the corridor above the second balcony. There, Box 7 waited like a wound reopened. He entered first, examining the freshly cleaned interior. The plush seats had been reupholstered, the carpet steamed. No trace of blood or wax remained. Even the scent of perfume had been scrubbed out by the scent of lemon oil and soap. But Holmes wasn't here to find old traces. He was here to bait the next. He turned to me. "Watson, I shall require you to remain in Box 11. Sit as you would on any other night. Read your program, peer through the opera glass. But watch for any movement in the far corner stairwell. If anyone attempts to slip into the corridor during the second act, note their behavior, particularly if they hesitate by this box." "Holmes," I said quietly, "what do you expect Broderick to do?" He looked at me with the calm of one who has already walked the outcome in his mind. "He'll try to repeat the scene, but not in exact form. He's too proud for that. He'll embellish, perhaps alter the placement, but he will return here or somewhere nearby. This was his crucible. He will not resist touching it again. And if he doesn't—" Holmes allowed the briefest shrug. "Then we wait." By 7 o'clock, the audience had begun filtering in, their murmurings and rustling fabrics adding texture to the air. La Traviata tonight. A lighter program than Don Giovanni, but still well attended. Holmes had taken a position 2 boxes away under the guise of a critic, his disguise impeccable. Thin mustache, rounded spectacles, a faint French accent muttered into a notepad. I settled into Box 11 with the performance schedule open on my lap, glancing occasionally at the far corner as instructed. The overture began, swelling from the pit like a rising tide, and for a time I forgot myself in the music. But Holmes's plan demanded vigilance, and so I kept watch. It was during the first act that I noticed him. Not Broderick, not directly, but a figure slipping from the crowd in the corridor near the upper stairwell. He wore a porter's jacket and cap, and carried a small tool satchel. Though his movements were too smooth, too deliberate for a laborer, he did not proceed down the hall, nor toward the stage. He paused by a curtain, glanced about, and then vanished into the shadow behind a pillar. I leaned forward, but could not see him clearly. Then, from the direction of the stairwell, another figure appeared. This one I recognized instantly. Mrs. Eugenia Astley. She was dressed simply, modestly, but with a poise that could not be mistaken. She did not enter a box. She moved straight toward the concealed figure. They exchanged no words, at least none that I could hear. She merely handed him something small, cylindrical, and turned away. He pocketed it and melted back behind the curtain. She descended the stairs with deliberate grace. I rose at once and made my way discreetly to the lower lobby, where Lestrade stood in a porter's uniform of his own, holding a tray of playbills. "Box corridor," I said softly. "A man disguised." Mrs. Astley just handed him something. Lestrade's eyes sharpened. "Holmes? He hasn't seen him yet. We need to flank." Lestrade nodded and passed a quick signal to one of his men across the lobby. Then we returned, ascending from opposite sides. As I reached the rear stairwell, I glimpsed the figure again. this time crouched low beside the back partition wall of Box 7. He held a small brass cylinder, what looked like a modified scope or viewing lens, and was affixing it to a panel near the curtain rod. It clicked into place with a whisper. That was when Holmes struck. He emerged from the side corridor, with the smooth precision of a man executing a final note. "Good evening, Mr. Broderick," he said, voice cutting through the noise, like the first drum roll before a hanging. "I see you've returned to your scene of triumph." Broderick turned, but did not run. His face had changed, hollowed slightly, but still carrying the force of a man who believed deeply in what he was doing. His disguise fell away with the cap, as he stood, the tool satchel discarded at his feet. "This was never about escape," he said. "I came to finish it." Holmes stepped closer. "By repeating it? By elevating it?" Broderick replied. "The first act drew no justice. The audience watched and applauded, and forgot. Tonight they will see the true cost." His voice wasn't theatrical. It was eerily calm. "You are going to kill again," Holmes said. "No," Broderick said, reaching into his coat. "Not kill, expose." But Lestrade was already behind him, and the cylinder, now clearly a listening device, cleverly disguised, was removed from the wall. Inside were papers. Thin, rolled documents. Holmes took them carefully. "Naval records," he said. "Private contracts, signed by Cornwell, copied illegally, but damning nonetheless." Broderick turned to him with weary defiance. "He buried them. Lodge financed the cover. I wanted them read aloud before the overture closed. The world would have known." Holmes nodded slowly. "But instead, you chose a bullet." Broderick said nothing. Lestrade snapped the cuffs on his wrists and turned him toward the stairwell. As he was led away, he paused. "She'll lie," he said. "Eugenia. She always lies." Holmes answered him without hesitation. "She already has." The curtain had risen by the time we returned to Box 11. Holmes removed his disguise piece by piece, watching the stage silently. At last I asked, "You knew it would be him?" "Yes," he said. "He was never a man who could vanish completely. The opera was his theater of revenge. He would return to it." "And the papers?" Holmes held up the cylinder. He intended to cast them into the stalls during the intermission. Let them scatter like petals, but even truth, when flung like confetti, can be missed. "And Lady Margaret?" I asked. Holmes looked toward the ceiling. "She chose confession, and in so doing, saved herself from complicity. It's the only reason I let her walk out tonight unchallenged. She's free, for now," he said. "But freedom, Watson, is often more a question of conscience than consequence." The final aria drifted up from the stage, and Holmes closed his eyes, listening. Below, the audience applauded. One performance had ended, but another, far more delicate, was only just beginning. The applause that closed the evening's performance still echoed faintly through the grand halls of the Royal Bradbury as Holmes and I walked out into the night, the fog thick and indifferent around us. Lestrade had already departed with Broderick in custody, the rolled documents secured, and the case, at least from the Yard's perspective, nearly concluded. But I knew Holmes too well to believe the matter was truly at rest. His face bore the familiar mask of quiet deliberation that always emerged when the final act had ended. But something in the wings still stirred. We walked in silence along Piccadilly, the damp cobbles slick beneath our shoes, until Holmes spoke. "She is the final piece," he murmured. "Lady Margaret?" I asked. He shook his head. "No." Eugenia Astley. Her hand was present at every turn, an intermediary here, a quiet guide there. It was she who brought Broderick the papers, she who arranged the seating, and she who tonight delivered the listening device disguised as a theatrical prop. And yet, despite it all, she remains untouched. "She denied nothing," I said. "Not openly, but she was careful never to confirm anything either." Holmes gave a short, humorless laugh. "Precisely. A perfect chorus member present in every scene, yet never the subject of the spotlight." He halted suddenly beneath a wrought iron lamp at the corner of Hanover Street, and pulled from his coat a folded sheet. Broderick's letter to Lady Margaret. He said she lies. Holmes murmured. It wasn't scorn. It was warning. I remembered the scene clearly. Broderick, hands cuffed, voice calm, speaking not with vengeance but with clarity. She'll lie. Eugenia, she always lies. She believes herself beyond suspicion, Holmes said. That's the danger. A villain, Watson, will conceal their face, but a manipulator hides their hands. We returned to Baker Street near midnight, and I expected Holmes to retreat into his usual post-case rhythm, a smoke by the fire, perhaps a melancholic tune drawn from his violin. Instead, he rang for Mrs. Hudson and requested ink, a clean sheet of parchment, and his international cipher index. He remained at the desk for over an hour, composing a letter in a hand that wasn't his own, his French diplomat's script, if I remembered rightly. When I asked its purpose, he gave no answer beyond a slight, unreadable smile. By morning the letter was gone, and Holmes had already vanished into the city. It was not until the third evening following Broderick's arrest that matters came to a head. I had returned from a long day at the practice, prepared to find Holmes mid-dissection of some tobacco ash or botanical bannacle. But instead I found the parlor lit dimly and Holmes seated near the window with a closed envelope in hand. She came, he said simply, not turning. Mrs. Ashley? He nodded. Just after noon. She left this. I took the envelope. It was unmarked. No wax seal, no initials. Inside were two items, a folded program from Don Giovanni, the night of Lord Cornwell's death, and a brief unsigned note. Some men conduct the orchestra, others compose the symphony, and some simply listen from the shadows, waiting to correct the notes. Your stage is finished. Mine continues. Holmes gestured to the paper. A veiled confession, if ever there was one. You think she orchestrated it all? Not all. She did not pull the trigger. She would not sully herself with something so coarse. But she set the tempo, arranged the players, and ensured the melody was one she approved of. Broderick's wrath was real, Margaret's guilt equally so. But Eugenia provided the rhythm. She pointed Broderick toward Margaret, stoked his grievance, and handed him both the motive and the means. And when the first act succeeded, she nearly led him to a second. But why? I asked. What did she gain? Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, watching the flames as though they might whisper something back to him. She was once engaged to Lord Cornwell, briefly, before Margaret, a connection most have forgotten. Cornwell ended it, publicly, and without tact. She was cast aside, and while she rebuilt herself in salons and drawing rooms, Cornwell rose through the Admiralty, never once acknowledging the humiliation he left behind. She held that grudge for over a decade. Holmes turned. It was not a grudge, Watson. It was a libretto. A story she composed note by note. When Broderick surfaced, disgraced and volatile, she saw her perfect soloist. And now? I asked. She'll disappear? She already has, he said. The program was delivered to a decoy address I arranged through the French embassy. She believes she's returned a final flourish, but in doing so, she's confirmed everything. Will you hand it to Lestrade? Holmes looked at me with a faint melancholy. No. There's no proof, no traceable act. Broderick won't betray her, and Margaret, while complicit in part, cannot be tied to Eugenia directly. And so the truth remains unspoken, as it so often does. We sat in silence a while, the fire hissing softly. You're troubled, I said. He exhaled slowly. Because justice, Watson, is not always synonymous with law. Broderick will hang. Larch may face financial ruin. Margaret will live under the shadow of her own conscience. But Eugenia, she'll host another salon in Florence or Paris and raise a glass to a past rewritten. He picked up the program again, studied the date. But even she knows she cannot return to the Bradbury. Not now. The stage remembers. And you? I asked. He smiled faintly. I never liked opera much, in truth. Too many performances, not enough honesty. Later that evening, as the fog rolled once more over the city, Holmes fetched his violin and played a quiet, simple melody, not the soaring dramatics of tragedy, but a soft, measured line, the kind of tune one might play when the curtain has fallen and the theater stands empty, and only the echo of footsteps remains. Outside, carriages rolled by, unaware that a man had died, a woman had vanished, and another would soon be sentenced for a murder that was only ever half his. And in our sitting room on Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes let the final note linger, one that would never be recorded in a newspaper nor spoken of again. The case was over, but the silence it left behind was, in its way, louder than applause. It rained again the following morning, not the theatrical downpour of a storm, but the thin, persistent drizzle that softened the edges of London and made every surface gleam with quiet reluctance. Holmes had not stirred from his chair since before dawn. The fire burned low, untouched, and the embers cast long shadows across his still frame. I recognized this posture, this silence. It was the aftermath of conclusion. For Holmes, a mind that thrived on the thrill of unraveling, endings were a quiet form of grief. I poured 2 cups of tea and set one beside him. He didn't reach for it. "She will not resurface," he said finally, eyes fixed on the smoke rising from the hearth. "No," I agreed, "but you're still watching for her." He nodded once. "Not because I expect a return, but because she left an opening. The program, the note, it wasn't farewell. It was an encore." He finally picked up the cup and stared into it as though the leaves might form a portrait of her face. "We must pay attention to people who vanish, just as the curtain falls. It is rarely the end they choose. It is a pause, a calculated intermission." There was a knock at the door. Holmes rose before I could respond and opened it himself. Inspector Lestrade stood on the threshold, coat dripping, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "Holmes," he said without ceremony, "we've had a development." He stepped inside, and I closed the door against the mist. Lestrade set his gloves down and drew a small object from his pocket, a crumpled telegram. He handed it to Holmes, who read it without expression. "Broderick found dead in his cell. No sign of forced entry. No noise reported. Cause, poison. Administered some hours before dawn." Holmes folded the telegram and stared at the hearth again. "How?" I asked quietly. Lestrade shook his head. "No visitors. No known accomplices. He ate from the same rations as the others. We're interviewing every guard. The autopsy confirms it. Belladonna and laudanum, enough to stop the heart." "Delivered how?" Holmes asked. "Possibly soaked into paper," Lestrade said. "He received one letter yesterday. We didn't intercept it in time." I knew what Holmes would say before he said it. "She sent it," he murmured. "The final act." Lestrade gave a heavy sigh and sat down. "There'll be an inquiry. Quiet, internal. They'll call it suicide." He was unstable, after all. "He wasn't," Holmes replied, not unkindly. "He was wounded, manipulated, but his hand did not shake when it pulled the trigger, and it would not have shaken now." Lestrade looked at him sideways. "You really think she silenced him?" "I don't think," Holmes said. "I know." He walked to the writing desk, lifted the empty envelope. Eugenia had left days ago, and held it to the light. The paper bore faint water damage, but beneath it, almost imperceptibly, were the outlines of faded script. Inkless impressions, as though someone had written on a sheet atop it, leaving only the ghost of words behind. Holmes reached into the drawer for graphite and gently shaded over the surface. One line emerged. "When silence becomes necessary, use the glass edge, not the blade. It leaves less protest." He looked to us. Instruction. Left by the conductor for her soloist, perhaps weeks ago, or perhaps long before that. Lestrade swore softly. "She planned even this." Holmes let the envelope fall. "She planned everything." We sat for some time without speaking. The fire had died to its final cinders. Outside, the city carried on, uncaring of the death of a disgraced soldier and the vanishing act of a woman who'd orchestrated so much from behind velvet curtains. "She's gone," Lestrade said eventually. "We'll never find her." "No," Holmes said, "but someone will." She cannot resist watching the performance unfold, and even she must take a final bow one day. Lestrade rose. "There'll be no trial, no closure for Cornwell. The press has already lost interest." Holmes stood too. "Justice," he said softly, "rarely follows applause." After Lestrade left, Holmes went to the cabinet and took out the program Eugenia had left. He set it on the table and stared at it for some time, then opened it. Folded within was a second sheet I had not seen before, a small clipping from a Parisian newspaper dated a year ago. It described a minor theatre's mysterious fire. Arson suspected. One patron unaccounted for. Among the names listed as present, Madame Machan, unknown patron of the arts. "She practiced," Holmes said aloud. "What do you mean?" "She rehearsed this. In Paris. The fire, the confusion, the escape. She's used this stage before. Only this time, the production was far grander, and the audience never even knew they'd attended something real." I looked at the page again, and I saw it then. The same rhythm, a pattern of erasure, of movements behind velvet rope. "What now?" I asked. Holmes folded the program, placed it in the drawer, and closed it, without locking it. "Now," he said, "we wait. Not for her, for the next man or woman who believes they are unseen." He turned back to the window. Rain trickled down the glass in long, slow rivulets. Beyond, London moved, smoke from chimneys, carriages rolling across puddled stone, laughter rising from a pub 3 doors down. "She'll leave no trail," I said. "Leave no trail." Holmes smiled faintly. "No, but she left a performance. And every performance has an audience. Someone will have noticed. Someone will speak." He walked to the fire, struck a match, and relit the logs with a practiced hand. The flame caught slowly, reluctantly, as though it too had been reluctant to return to this tale. "Until then," he said, "we attend the silence." And I understood, as I had so many times before, that Holmes did not seek applause or recognition. He waited, always, for the second curtain, the one that fell without warning, the one that revealed not only the truth but the shape of those who hid behind it. In the quiet that followed, I began to write. Not the story for the newspapers. This one would not be printed, but a record, held in trust. A note between movements, for the day the audience was finally ready to hear the music that had played in secret all along. For this was no ordinary murder. This was theater, and somewhere, far from the echo of applause, the widow of the second balcony still watched in shadow, waiting for the next cue. The following days passed in a kind of subdued rhythm, as though the city itself had absorbed the weight of what had unfolded. Holmes returned to his morning routine, early papers, untouched breakfast, and long hours at the window in silent thought. Yet there was a perceptible shift in his manner, something restrained and vigilant beneath the surface. He had not let go of the case. It had simply changed shape. Though Broderick was gone, and the documents recovered, there lingered a sense that something remained unresolved. And Holmes, never content with the veneer of resolution, moved through the days as one listening for the faintest echo of a note that had not yet ended. One afternoon, just as the sun broke faintly through the slate clouds, I found Holmes leaning over the long table near the rear of the sitting room, where he had arranged various papers, letters, and theater programs in an elaborate configuration. He was not merely revisiting the case, he was dissecting its structure, as though reconstructing a play to understand the playwright's mind. "I've been thinking, Watson," he said, without lifting his eyes from the arrangement. "Why a theater for the murder?" I asked, stepping closer. "You said it yourself. Symbolism, concealment in plain sight, timing." "Yes," he said, "but that was merely the stagecraft. What I ask now is, why was she so devoted to the theater? Why return to the same motif? Across cities, across years. Paris, Milan, now London. These aren't just locations, they're choices. I considered this. She was a patron of the arts. No, he said, with quiet certainty. She was something else. A creator. He reached into the pile and drew out the Parisian news clipping again. The theater fire. The vanished patron. This fire. Notice the name of the destroyed production. I leaned in. L'envers du masque. The reverse of the mask. Holmes translated. It ran only 2 nights. Written by an anonymous author. But reviews described it as a study of moral vanishing. Of people who erase themselves to become what others fear most. And this name here, buried in the cast list, E. Mach. She wasn't just a patron. She was involved in the production. She was an actress? I asked. He shook his head. Worse. She was a playwright. I stared at him. You believe she wrote that production? I believe she wrote it, staged it, and then destroyed it. A trial run. A rehearsal for a far more elaborate act. The fire was no accident. It was the final cue. She wrote herself out of existence, then rewrote herself under a new name. My mind reeled. And in London, she did the same, or tried to. But this time the audience lingered. We saw too much. He tapped the program she had left. She never signed her note, because her name no longer matters. It is the role that survives. Before I could respond, there came the sound of heavy boots on the stairs. Lestrade burst into the room, face drawn, hat still in hand. He did not wait for pleasantries. She struck again. Holmes turned instantly. Where? The Italian embassy. Private reception, small gathering. A diplomat's wife collapsed midway through the toast. Poison. Same as Broderick, Belladonna and Laudanum. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Why her? Lestrade shook his head. We don't know. No apparent connection. But the seating chart. He pulled a folded card from his coat. The victim was seated in second balcony, box 7. Silence fell. It's not just a calling card anymore, Holmes said. It's a signature. Lestrade exhaled. We questioned every guest. No one remembers seeing her. No mention of Eugenia Astley. No guest under any known alias. She wouldn't have come as herself, Holmes murmured. She would have watched from the periphery, perhaps as staff or performer. And she wouldn't need to be near the victim, just near the glass. He turned to the map of theater layouts he had begun sketching earlier in the week. She recreates settings, returns to the same spatial configurations. Second balcony, box 7, always. The distance, the angle of view, the concealment. It's not just a habit, it's ritual. She stages the illusion before the act. Lestrade leaned on the back of the chair. We're chasing a ghost. No, Holmes said. We're chasing a director. And every time she acts, she sharpens her control. I felt the growing chill behind his words. So what's next? She has no reason to stop, Holmes said. Not now. Broderick is dead. Her former ties are severed. And this latest murder, unconnected, unexplained. It signals something more dangerous. She's moved from vengeance to pure composition. Lestrade frowned. You mean she's killing for art? I mean, Holmes said, she believes she is writing something no court can comprehend. And as long as her audience remains confused, she will continue. Every performance will be tighter, quieter, more elusive, until we miss it entirely. Lestrade straightened. Then we need to stop her before she writes the next act. Holmes stepped toward the window, watching as 2 boys darted through the rain below, their laughter rising faintly. There's only one way now, he said softly. We must write the next act for her. He turned back to us. A public venue, a staged setting, a false target. Something she cannot resist. We present a performance, Watson, and we bait her with the illusion of control. You want to build a trap. Lestrade said. Holmes nodded. But not a net, a mirror. He walked to the mantel and removed the only remaining program from the Bradbury series, Tosca, scheduled for the following week. Second balcony. Box 7. He murmured. We reserve it. We leak the presence of a notable guest. Perhaps a controversial official with past ties to Cornwall. We let the theatre hum with rumor. And we wait, I said. No, Holmes said. We act. I will take the box. Alone. I opened my mouth to object, but he held up a hand. She knows me. She's studied me. If she suspects I'm near, she will come, not to kill, not immediately, but to watch, to see how I move, to test her ability to shape the scene. Lestrade frowned. But how will we catch her? We won't, Holmes said. She will reveal herself. And he said it not with arrogance but with certainty born of obsession. That night, long after Lestrade had gone, and the rain had hardened into cold needles against the panes, Holmes sat again at the fire. But this time he played no melody. He merely watched the flames rise and fall, as though calculating the breadth of the inferno he now sought to step into. She has written her script, he said quietly. Now it is time we compose ours. And I knew, with a kind of dread I could not name, that the final curtain had not yet fallen. The widow of the second balcony had not left the stage. She had merely stepped behind the curtain, waiting for the cue to begin again. The night of the performance arrived with a cold clarity. The fog held at bay as if even the London mist dared not intrude upon what was to unfold. The Royal Bradbury shimmered beneath gaslight and expectation. Tosca was the program, though few in the audience knew they had come not only for opera, but for a confrontation years in the making. Box 7, second balcony, had been discreetly reserved under the name of a foreign official, one rumored, through carefully planted whispers, to have overseen contracts implicated in Lord Cornwall's old dealings. His name was false, of course. The man in the box was Sherlock Holmes. He wore no disguise that night, only the sharp silhouette of himself, outlined by theatre gloom and expectation. I watched from the opposite box, positioned as planned. Lestrade and his men moved through the audience, like shadows. No handcuffs, no rifles, only eyes trained on entrances, exits, stairwells, and most importantly, the places in between. The overture began. And so did the play. Holmes sat motionless through the first act, fingers laced, gaze unwavering. I knew him well enough to see it was not the music he followed, but the shape of movement in the wings, the rhythm of shadows. During the intermission, nothing stirred. No figure paused by the velvet curtains, no unfamiliar face slipped behind the drapery. It was nearly a disappointment. And then, just as the audience settled again for Act 2, I saw her. She entered, not through the main doors but from the far-end corridor, the one reserved for staff and musicians. Her figure was familiar even in the dim, tall, elegant, unhurried. She wore a dark shawl, not to conceal but to suggest she was meant to be ignored. She moved with the practiced calm of someone who had crossed these thresholds for decades. She took no seat. She did not approach the boxes. She positioned herself halfway between the projection booth and the lower rigging, a place few would notice but from which every motion in Box 7 could be seen. Holmes did not move. She watched him. For 7 minutes, she stood that way, her hand lightly at her side, where a small object, round, metallic, hung by a cord beneath her shawl. Holmes reached forward then, and picked up a glass of water from the table beside him. He raised it slowly, deliberately, and placed it back down. The effect was immediate. She stepped back, 1 pace only. Her fingers tightened, and in that moment, the spell fractured. Lestrade appeared behind her softly, like a cue struck from a distant percussionist. She did not startle. She turned to him, and for the first time in all the days we'd chased her across theaters and embassies and whispers, I saw the full truth of Eugenia Astley's face. Not fear, not even defiance, just recognition, as though she'd expected it all along. It was never about vengeance, Holmes said as he descended from his box. That was Broderick's part. Yours was composition. You chose each player. You built the story. You needed a man like him, broken, proud, easy to conduct. She said nothing. You sent the poisoned letter. You arranged the Italian diplomat's death, not to silence, but to sustain attention. A second movement after the first crescendo. Still she said nothing. Lestrade spoke. You'll answer for it now. In court. She smiled, only faintly. There are no courts for authors, Inspector. Only critics. They took her quietly, with the audience never knowing a thing. The opera ended minutes later, its final notes fading into applause that had nothing to do with the truth, just played out above their heads. Later, back at Baker Street, Holmes stood by the window, silent for a long while. I poured him tea, untouched, and waited. She wanted to be caught, I said eventually. Didn't she? He nodded. Not quite. She wanted to end the story, but on her own terms, and we gave her one, I said. An ending. No, he said. A final act. There's a difference. I understood then what had truly haunted Holmes all along. It wasn't that she had killed. It wasn't even that she had orchestrated the death so beautifully, so efficiently, so invisibly. It was that she had seen the world as theater and played her part without ever once believing in guilt. She told the truth, Holmes said softly. Some simply wait in the shadows to correct the notes. That was her, a correction. In her mind, a necessary redrafting, and yet she ends in silence. Holmes turned back to the window, watching the last of the carriages roll through the wet street below. Not silence, he said, only an unfinished composition. He let the curtain fall, and so the case of the widow of the second balcony closed, not with a thunderous verdict or a celebrated trial, but with a curtain drawn in a private room, on a quiet street. While the city moved on, most would never know what had passed behind that velvet drapery, or how close they had come to watching a real tragedy unfold. But Holmes would remember. And I had written it all. Not for the press, not for acclaim, but for the record, because every audience deserves, one day, to understand the story they never realized they'd been watching.